Okay, we'll get started. My name is Mike Frank. I'm the director here at Hoover's Washington, D.C. office. I want to welcome everybody. Quick reminder, if you can turn off cell phones, that would be appreciated. Welcome today. We have a great book event. You all know, but this is the book. It's The Case for Trump by our own senior fellow, Victor Davis Hanson. We were checking today on Amazon, and this is now the number one book, I believe, in all of Amazon for American history. It's the number two book on, I think it's politics, and number overall for everything, including recipe books and self-help books, everything is number 8. And it came online, the publication date was Tuesday. It's already sold about 40,000 copies. So this thing is gangbusters, and we're really honored to have the author here today. So let me give a quick introduction to Victor Davis Hanson. First and most important to us, he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. We're out in California, if you don't know, part of Stanford, and we're proud to have him as one of our most popular and most important senior fellows. He's also the Wayne and Marcia Busk Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, Professor of Classics Emeritus at California State University at Fresno, where he founded the Classics Department. Great story behind that. BA from the University of California, Santa Cruz, PhD in Classics from Stanford. In 2007, he was awarded the highest, I think it's the highest civilian award any president can bestow upon an American citizen, the National Humanities Medal. And the following year, he won another very, very important and prestigious award, the Bradley Prize from the Bradley Foundation. Columnist for National Review Online, Tribune Media Services. He's published pretty much everywhere, too long of a list to mention. He's written or edited over 20 books, including Wars of the Ancient Greeks, A War Like No Other, How the Athenians and Spartans Fought the Peloponnesian War, The Savior Generals, How 5 commanders saved wars that were lost from ancient Greece to Iraq, and his latest book, which I also highly recommend, The Second World Wars, How the First Global Conflict Was Fought and Won. And I'm just going to do a quick segue to say, answer a question that I had, and I've had for a long time, reading his columns in National Review and American Conservative and so on. Why would such a renowned classicist want to engage in current political and historical events, as Victor Davis Hanson has? So let me just read a couple of quotes from him from the 2007 National Humanities Medal ceremony and one from the Bradley Award. And first, a tribute from Donald Kagan, the Yale classicist who is top of the field as well. Hanson's work on the role of the small family farmer in the development of democracy is the most important work in Greek history in my lifetime. Nobody told that story before Hanson, and its significance is hard to exaggerate. Now, from Hanson himself. Studying the classics for 8 years, both here and abroad, and teaching them for 20 years, all reiterated the sense that human nature was unchanging and the human ordeal predictable. Whether it was working on a farm or reading Sophocles or Thucydides, the message kept being reiterated in different ways. Nothing really changes. And another quote, I don't see enough people standing up to defend the West. We don't realize how tenuous this legacy is and how it has to be transmitted from generation to generation. The nature of man doesn't change, and that's reassuring since we know the necessary conditions that can save him from himself. The legacy of the West is a guidance system through the natural perils of human nature and behavior. And finally, from the Bradley Prize, if we are to keep what we inherited, we must condemn religious intolerance wherever we see it, pseudoscience wherever we hear it, and impossible utopian demands upon us wherever we read of them, and to do so with the newfound sense of humility and recognition of our own limitations. Of all the traits that we prize, courage and expression at this hour is the most critical, which I think forms the basis for why he would engage on writing the case for Trump. And I'll say one last thing before I turn it over to Professor Hanson. You know who he dedicates the book to? The deplorables. So, Professor Hanson, welcome.
Well, I came here to hear questions from you and from Michael, so I'm just going to give you a 5 to 7 minute synopsis of the book. I hope I have courage because I was called a Nazi today in a modern Heidegger in an article, and there's more of that to come. What I thought was unique about Donald Trump in 2015-16 is that he was running against the most gifted Republican field that I'd seen in my lifetime, 16 very qualified people. And yet he was able not only to defeat them, but to craft an agenda that was 60 or 70% Orthodox Republican, which would not necessarily have won in the general election, given that the Republican Party had lost 5 out of 6 of the last popular votes in presidential elections and had not won 51% since 1988 when George H.W. Bush did it, and yet had been very successful, winning over 1,100 offices at the state and local level during the Obama administration. So there was something wrong with that message, at least in giving a conservative a chance to win the presidency. So what did he add to it? He had these strange issues. I don't think they're strange, but people did. That sovereignty was necessary and impossible without a secure border, and that you would not be able to assimilate, integrate, and intermarry immigrants unless they came in measured, diverse, legal, and meritocratic fashion. And then the second was that everybody talked about China, but they did it with a wink and nod as if its hegemony, the arc of history, was all going to be Chinese. You couldn't stop them. And yet Trump noticed that it's still, at this late date, about one Chinese citizen produces, one American citizen, if we could use that rough rubric, produces about 3 times the goods and services of the Chinese counterpart. China threatens the world with one carrier group, maybe. We have 10 to 11. So Trump suggested that we calibrate our attitude on mercantilism, technological appropriation, dumping, copyright, and patent infringement in a part of a larger effort to say that China is not the fated leader of the world, and if it were to be the fated leader of the world, things would be very bad for the world. A third issue was he even though that globalization had been a bi-coastal phenomenon, and that people were almost confusing cause and effect. I quoted a lot of things in the book, that people in the Midwest, these cities that had been part of the Rust Belt, it was almost as if the people themselves drove industry away, rather than industry was driven away by cosmic factors and they suffered for it. But he made the argument that you could reindustrialize or use manufacturing or raise workers' wages or get unemployment down further, and that this was going to, these groups were going to experience a renaissance. That was quite striking, quite striking. In addition to immigration and trade and China, he also added something that was, I think, caused him trouble later on, but at least ostensibly he said we're not going to engage in what he called optional military engagements, where we weren't not able, and I'm paraphrasing now, to translate battlefield or tactical success into strategic resolution. Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, etc. And then he made all of these arguments in a geographical context. In other words, he said that they're tailor-made to Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, places like Florida. And then the message was that the Obama model, that with the new changing demography and new identity politics, that that was the wave of the future, and that the alienation of the white working class or just the working classes would not matter very much, but that record turnout of identity politics groups could be passed on to a 69-year-old multimillionaire like Hillary Clinton. And I don't think Trump believed that was true. So once he won, then people had warned us from the right he would either govern as a liberal, he would appoint his sister, for example, to the Supreme Court, or that he would get us into a war, in, Little Rocket Man and all of that stuff, or he would crash the economy. If we just take the name Trump out of it, and we look at his foreign policy, and you look at vis-a-vis Russia, for example, he beefed up sanctions, He armed the Ukrainians. He got rid of this idea that you could have a wink and a nod, good behavior collusion with Putin. He started the mechanics of restoring missile defense. He upped our efforts to increase missile defense. And it was much tougher than the Obama reset had been envisioned. If you look at China, I mentioned China, it's a new approach. Whatever happens in North Korea, I don't think they're sending missiles into our allies' airspace or testing nuclear weapons with a frequency that they used to. He got out of the Iran deal. There were over 250 examples of Iranian aggression, hazing, sending missiles, overflights, buzzing ships. Before he took office, there were, I think, 2 in 2018 in the Straits of Hormuz. If you look at NATO, he said a lot of reckless things, but the fact is that the NATO countries knew that only 6 of them were meeting their 2% guidelines, and I think now they've collectively committed to $100 billion in additional resources. So the foreign policy, I think, it has been successful. The economy has been successful culturally, psychologically, on these other issues. I don't think anybody thought that he would appoint and rush through with the aid of the Congress in such a heroic way by Mitch McConnell, but he's got more conservative justice through quicker than any other Republican president. I don't think there will be a nomination such as a David Souter or an attempted nomination like Harriet Miers without editorialization. I just think he's going to go that route. He's having problems at the border largely because people feel that he's an extremist right now and he's under stress, and that if you're going to cross the border illegally and do it en masse, now's the time to do it before it's clear who wins this battle to secure the border. But he's making efforts, and it really translates to me when I see Hispanic people that I live next to who tell me for the first time in their life they have more than one employer trying to vie for their labor, and they attributed that to this record low Hispanic unemployment and forces at the border that are discouraging illegal alternatives to their own labor. And I think Trump, and this is counterintuitive and maybe, I don't know, heretical, but I think he will get 35 to 45% of the Hispanic vote just for that reason. And if he's wise and he can emphasize that there's a lot of biases coming out from this new wing of the Democratic Party, especially anti-Catholic bias, and not just partial birth abortion, but virtual infanticide. And I'll just finish very quickly as what about 2020? In 2016, a number of people voted for him. Despite Trump, they voted against Hillary. Not the majority, but a sizable number. I think there's going to be that effect to a greater degree in 2020, and he's going to be able to offer the argument that whatever he is, he's not socialism, and he might be the only thing between you and socialism, only because if you look at that new basket of issues that the left of the Democratic Party is trying to tar their mainstream, partial birth abortion, if not infanticide, Medicare for all, a wealth tax, 70 to 90% top rate, the new Green Deal, the abolition of ICE, not just not building any more walls, but maybe even tearing down the wall, as Beto said, on the border. Those are not polling 51%. And if that is the issue, these are the issues that are forced upon the Democratic nominee, it'll be something, I think, close to what happened in 1972, if not 1984. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you,
Okay.
Michael. Thank you.
Yeah. In one of your chapters, you start with a quote from Joseph Epstein, and I'll read it, and ask you to elaborate a little bit on it. He quoted his son. So, "I approve of almost everything he," meaning Trump, "has done," my son remarked, "and I disapprove of almost everything he has said." Okay. Now, there's a cognitive dissonance there that a lot of people that I know have been grappling with, who are conservative in their policy orientations and a little bit frustrated at the style, the tweeting, and so on that accompanies this president. And you have a very good, long discussion about how how that plays out and some of the policy issues that have been successful and so on. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that aspect?
That was the central thesis of I guess we're not supposed to use the word never Trump, but that was their thesis, that issues that they used to be for and still are for, they can no longer promote under the aegis of Donald Trump because his fingerprints have so tarnished those issues that they've now opposed him, and they've opposed him on the grounds that his character is such that it nullifies the message. The problem I have with that is that for that to be true, there has to be some corollaries. One of them would be that although he's had no first president without military or political experience, he has to have said things and done things that we've never seen before in a president. And that has to accommodate the idea that we live in an era of social media, an unrestrained press in the sense of 90% of it, according to Sorensen Center, is anti-Trump, and the internet. And by that, and I don't think that thesis has been proven. I'd just like to give you 3 or 4, throw these thoughts out there. If Harry Truman lived today under the circumstances that Trump is engaging in, I think we would probably have a nonstop prosecutor like Mr. Mueller investigating all of his Kansas City ties to what was basically a mafia operation that produced Truman. Mm-hmm. We would probably be told that he was so incompetent that Roosevelt only met him one time before he became president. He had no idea what the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project was when he walked into office. And then he wrote a letter to a critic of his daughter's concert, and he said essentially he was going to beat him up, and then where his genitals were, there would be nothing. And if you think, well, that was an aberration, you could say that FDR, I think accurately, Anna Roosevelt was arranging affairs while he was president with Lucy Mercer all through the last years of his presidency, and he had over 240 top systolic pressure, blood pressure, and yet that was hidden from the public because they thought they could keep him alive enough to win the presidency in ~44 and keep a Democratic continuity. That kind of pales to our questions about Trump's Lipitor or whether he takes some additive or what we talked about during the 25th Amendment. So far as I know, Mr. Trump has not taken his phallus out and said, does anybody, Ho Chi Minh have anything like this, in a way that's been reported by some LBJ biographers. He doesn't have memo, he doesn't have his people, he doesn't issue memos while he's defecating on the toilet in front of his aides. And nobody, I think we're going to get a lot of memoirs about his randy past, but I don't think a 19-year-old working now in the White House is going to later write a memoir how she was deflowered by Donald Trump in the presidential bed the way Mimi Alford said that she was by JFK. I'm not saying that this tu quoque classical argument is valid, that they do it too. I'm just asking for a little humility and perspective. And Truman left office the most unpopular president in history until George Bush. And he did things that people thought were absolutely atrocious at the time. He integrated the armed forces without really talking to the Pentagon. He fired national hero Douglas MacArthur, and he said, I should have fired that SOB a long time ago. Let that be known to the press. He turned on the Roosevelt State Department and said, that SOB lied to me, Stalin, we're not going to have any more relations. And he started the doctrine of containment. Worst of all, Dean Acheson, George Marshall, begged him not to recognize Israel. He did, to absolute horror among people in the permanent bureaucracy. So I think we all need to take a deep breath and look at this historical framework and the strange electronic lynch mob that we're in today. And I think if you do that, it doesn't mean that Donald Trump's a saint, but he's not an aberration either. And I'd just like to finish with one thing. We still don't know in America the relationship between public behavior and private behavior or public morality. And we're not religious people. That's for the God and his representatives on earth to adjudicate. But this idea that everything is canceled out by a person without character, I won't get into what the Greek word character really meant. It's been misquoted in relation to Trump. But I will say that had George Patton, he was taken off for for 1 year after his Sicily victory because he reportedly slapped a soldier, which he shouldn't have done. And you could make the argument that thousands of people died when he was not allowed to lead the assault right from the Normandy beaches. And you can make the argument that at the time he was leading the Third Army to the Rhine, he was conducting an affair with his stepniece in Paris. If we had said, my God, what a pervert, and we had ripped that command out of him and let Omar Bradley have total control and picked a better Third Army commander, I think we would have lost another 100,000 casualties. I could make that argument for an uncouth person like Curtis LeMay or William Tecumseh Sherman. Again, it's not an argument for bad character, it's just an argument for we're humans, we're not divinities.
One other question, then we'll turn it to the audience. Everyone has cards in front of you, so we will have someone come and pick them up maybe over the next few minutes to those who have already filled them out, and I'll work through them for the rest of the questions. But this question is, you have, well, I think my favorite chapter in the book was the one on Trump and whether he's a hero.
Yeah.
And the way you draw upon Greek literature and the mythology and so on, but also Westerns, the films,
Yeah.
and how the heroes are sort of ambivalent or anti-heroes in many cases, and what happens to them at the end, and then you relate it to some of the things going on with the president. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? That's a real teaser to make you guys read further and further and further into the book.
Well, I wanted to get the reader, I didn't know what references would resonate with the reader, so I used all of them. I don't think very many people said, that's it, he's Sophocles' Ajax. But if you read Sophocles' Ajax, all Ajax does is whine and say that the armor of Achilles should have gone to him, but the deep state, Agamemnon and Menelaus, rigged the whole deal, and he really did win the war, and he gets no credit, and why is this? And he has a valid argument, but you want to say, be quiet, Ajax, the world's not fair, get on with your life. But I also mentioned people such as Dirty Harry. I even mentioned Taken. I tried to mention that brilliant film that was on, appreciated Man on Fire, but Denzel Washington's in. Yeah. And then I concentrated on the stories that some of us grew up with on the big screen. Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, Shane, Will Kane in High Noon, Magnificent Seven. There is a sort of a trait that the community in that genre, the sodbusters, they have an existential enemy. They're usually cattle barons or banditos, but they don't have the wherewithal, or they're in a situation where they can't address the existential threat, and they don't have alternative methods, the law enforcement. So they invite someone in, or someone happens upon them or accidentally bumps into them, in the case of Shane, and they're sort of worried, they're dubious of their past, they don't seem to be credible, and yet they have, I think, a set of skills, as one person put it, that could come to be of their benefit. And so whether it's finding Natalie Wood in The Searchers, or whether it's getting rid of 4 people who are terrorizing the town in High Noon, or whether it's getting E.Y. Wallach out of the hair of poor villagers with the Magnificent Seven, they accomplish the task, but as they become successful in that endeavor, people start to have a margin of luxury. They start to think, well, things are getting a little better. I really didn't like the way he said that. I really didn't like the way he did that. And then they start to realize, as Curtis LeMay said, even if we win the war, I'm going to be considered a war criminal. They realize that society is going to reach a point where they're going to have the luxury of renouncing the very person who was very instrumental in them. Sort of what Henry Kissinger said, or at least he was alleged said in an interview not too long ago, I think it was in the Atlantic, where he said, every once in a while a man like Trump comes in and he disrupts things and he questions things you're not supposed to question, and that has utility. It reminds me finally of that scene where Shane is just about ready to take out Jack Palance, but somebody says, it might be this guy Jack Wilson, and Shane said, Wilson, what do he look like? And then a self-righteous sodbuster who's just about ready to be saved in the ensuing gunfight says, I don't like gunfighting. I don't like the idea you might know him, Shane. As if, go out and get rid of the problem and get the hell out of here, and don't ever tell anybody that you work for us. That's sort of the attitude.
One thing I like about Professor Hanson is being a classicist and being able to conjure up all those analogies. Also in the book, he references one of my favorite movies, not a Western, but Caddyshack, and compares Trump to the Rodney Dangerfield character in Caddyshack. Could you say one or two sentences about that? Because I was cheering out loud when I read that part.
Well, I thought that, do you remember is it Ted Knight character,
Yeah.
Judge Smales, is that his name?
Smales.
I thought he was more like Hillary Clinton, or maybe the establishment, that Trump had, people, I don't think, I'm not trying to be a toady, but there are elements of Trump's character that people miss, that he's getting more and more self-deprecatory. Remember when he said that if I drank alcohol, I'd be a disaster? Or he's made fun of his hair.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever we think about him, or you think about him, or his critics think of him, I don't think Donald Trump in 2020 will suddenly discover duck hunting and put on camouflage. I don't think he's going to go in the inner city and drop his G's the way Barack Obama did. I don't think he's going to go into a bowling alley and drink Boilermakers as Hillary did and say, you all. Whatever he is, he's going to have a Queen's accent, he's going to have black shiny shoes and that mile-long tie and that suit wherever he is. And that, I think, helps explain why the establishment missed this idea when they kept saying, John Kasich's the populist. He's the populist, not Donald Trump. Billionaires can't be populists. And they didn't understand that populism is it's a state of mind in many cases. It's an empathy. And how we got in this paradox, I can't explain, but we had somebody who supposedly can be very cruel, and he can be, and yet he has an empathy when he talks about our workers, our vets, our lathe workers, or even my favorite, I'm going to restore big, beautiful coal. When he went to Appalachia, that's a much more empathetic statement than Hillary Clinton says, I'm going to put a lot of you out of work.
We have a first round of cards with questions. A couple of them get at a related point, but it's not directly with respect to President Trump, but I think it's important. What can be done about the fact that students are not being taught history, but rather politically correct points of view? And what can be done to promote the classics to our youth? They're related. Any advice there?
Yeah, I've written a book about that, Who Killed Homer, and it's all about rewards and punishments. I think Orwell said something that's applicable to most academics. If it paid better, they'd be fascist. And by that I mean that 95% of the professorate are left-wing, and they are not the classical liberal. I was taught by people who voted for Adlai Stevenson, but they may have been left-wing, but they were disinterested, and they were scholarly, and had you taken 40% of their time and devoted it to diversity and gender and all that stuff, they wouldn't have known, they wouldn't have been able to teach us how to read Homer at sight or how to read and write in Latin and Greek. So, but this new generation was taught by the people, my generation, who taught, we were sort of Democrats taught by Adlai Stevenson and Democrats, and then we taught socialists, and now socialists are teaching communists almost. So there isn't anybody, and how do you stop that? Well, the rewards, if you're in a department, you say something, you're going to be fired. If you walk across the Stanford campus and you want to give a lecture and say there is no such thing as man-made global warming, I mean, there probably is, but not, if you said something like, I don't think the government in a cost-benefit analysis can really stop global warming in a way that might not cripple the economy, that would be an arguable position. You wouldn't be allowed to say it. If you said, I want to ban most abortions, you wouldn't have been able to say it. If you say, I do not want any more theme houses, safe spaces, censorship like Trigger Want, you wouldn't be able to say it. Pretty sure you wouldn't. So how do you stop that? And the answer is that alumni have to stop giving money to universities that's not targeted. That's giving drugs to an addict. They have to give money and say this is for this particular purpose. Not that it won't be abused and misappropriated, but there's less chance. I think tenure has to be recalibrated as a series of contracts, 4 years contract. You do this, at the end of your contract, you'll be given another, not lifetime tenure. I think that the School of Education could be phased out by offering a person who graduates. If you really want to get a teaching credential, maybe you can go to the School of Education. But if you just spend a year and get an academic MA, the way a junior college teacher is, and you can teach high school or grammar school. without a credential, as long as you have an academic. It would be much better for the students. And finally, I think the government's got to get out of this student debt trap, because once you start guaranteeing student loans, you're creating these perpetual student sort of Life of Julia pajama boy profiles where they go to school for 3 units, kind of sort of do it. The graduation rates are going from 4 years to 6 years to 8 years. The debt piles up, and the universities have a guaranteed stream of cash. So not only do they have rock climbing walls and boutique Club Med dorms now, but they've got less and less teaching and more diversity czars and therapeutic waste of money. And there's no incentive for them to cut back as long as the poor student. Very funny how a liberal institution can be so illiberal. I wish we just had a law like car salesmen are subject to. You go to college and they say, this is how much money you're borrowing, this is how much you're going to owe. If you major in this thing, these are the job opportunities. You major in this field, these are the job opportunities. And by law, I have to apprise you that you're going into a $250,000 debt, just like when you buy a semi-truck or something. But we don't do that.
Question about Trump and Russia. Why do some claim that Trump is so pro-Russian when he is arming Ukrainian with lethal defensive weapons? And it's hard to read the rest of this, but basically he's done a lot of things policy-wise that you could interpret clearly as being very hawkish relative to the U.S. relationship, yet he's criticized for in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the 2016 election. I don't think anybody calibrated the sheer furor, bewilderment, what happened after the night of the election. The night of the election, the New York Times said there was going to be a 2, 7, and 12% chance of Trump winning. Nate Silver, who was a very astute pollster, demographer, or whatever analyst, was kind of criticized for saying, I think he said Trump had a 26% chance. That was heresy. And so people were shocked. And when Trump sort of said things, joked about things like, maybe we can get Putin to find out with the missing emails or things like that, that became more and more fodder. And so, and this was during the campaign. I know that people argue that the dossier wasn't released until January by BuzzFeed, but remember people like Michael Iskoff and David Corn were reporting on sources who tell us all this stuff that was in the dossier, which had been planted all during the August, September, and October. Husserl on August 1st had met with a group at the Justice Department. So there was a feeling that Trump was different, beyond the pale. You had to stop him by any means necessary, and then he won. And boy, is he going to find out what's happened to us while we were doing. Evelyn Farkas at DOD said we were really worried to get everything spread it out so he couldn't stop just what we found out coming out, but the methods we used to surveil him. So there was that issue that Russia caused Hillary. It wasn't that she went into Georgia and Arizona when she had no business wasting her resources. It wasn't that she was a lousy candidate. It wasn't she said some of the stupidest things in political history by deplorables, irredeemables, put you out of work. It wasn't any of that, or the health issues that she raised. It was because Russia was the magic bullet that explained everything. And then there was that hysteria. Jeff Sessions recused himself. And that's a long, windy explanation for not looking at the Russia issue empirically. We forget that reset, that when Ambassador McFaul and Hillary Clinton took that red jacuzzi button in Switzerland and grabbed it, mistranslated as the reset button, that was a criticism of George W. Bush for being too punitive in punishing Putin for the Ossetia incursion. And so we were told that it was a new time and we're not going to be tough and mean, we're going to be therapeutic, and we started to cancel missile defense, remember, and then the famous hot mic, if you'll just give me Vladimir will just give me a little room during my election. It's kind of classical collusion, quid pro quo. Then I won't, give me a little room, and then after I'm elected, we can do business, i.e. give concessions. And then there wasn't much of a reaction to Crimea. There wasn't much reaction to Ukraine. other than disappointment that reset had failed. And so when Trump came in, I think part of it was his naivete. He thought he was going to get kind of tough on Putin. And so he could joke and say whatever he wanted. But if you look at, as the questioner pointed out, if you look at sanctions on Putin, if you look at arming Ukrainian elements, if you look at 3 million barrels more a day since the Obama administration are being pumped, and what that's done to world oil prices and the relations that has on Putin. If you look at the jawboning against Merkel and Putin's oil deal, it's a pretty tough record. And the sad thing about all of this is that, besides the fact that the left and Democrats used to always say we have to be realistic about Russia, that's all out the window now. They've become unhinged by Russia. But I don't want to quote Henry Kissinger more than once in a meeting, but remember he said something to effect in his memoirs that it's a pillar of U.S. policy that China should be no closer to Russia than we are, and Russia should be no closer to China than we are. In other words, there are elements in dealing with China. And he said that when Russia was the dominant partner and China was weak, but it's applicable when China's strong, then and Russia's relatively weak. We're missing an opportunity on things like Korea and Iran to use Russia, just because we've taken it all off the table, because to do so would be to convict Donald Trump and finally find the proof that he colluded.
I like this question. Few people change dramatically after, say, 65 years of age. Trump did not seem to be a conservative for his first 65 years. What is your view? Did he change? Did he hide his conservatism? Was the perception wrong, or is it something else?
It's a very good question. Part of it, I think, was just utility. When he looked at that field, he wanted to be president for a lot of reasons, but when he looked at that field, I don't think there was any way that he could run on the Republican. I think he understood that a third-party candidate had never won the presidency, never will win the presidency, and then he realized that he had to be conservative, but that past liberal strain or that unorthodox strain or whatever he was, I think he's changed party affiliations a number of times, might be of advantage in winning this Reagan Democrat, white working class, deplorables, silent majority who were getting a little bit upset with Republican orthodoxy. And so I think he thought that he could blend his past with his present in a way that would be acceptable to Republicans, but would entice other voters that the Republicans just had not been able to win. And then he, in some ways, even his official party affiliation or what he said was not as important to in the manner that he said it. He was basically also saying, I'm not a Marcus of Queensbury Republican anymore. I'm not going to do like John McCain and take Reverend Wright off the table the first day of the campaign. I'm sorry. If Candy Crawley had to grab that microphone in the second debate as she did with Mitt Romney in front of Trump, I think he would have got a Ronald Reagan response out of him. So there was a deep-seated feeling that among Republicans, not just the deplorables, but establishment, that the Republicans had been playing by a different set of rules, at least since Lee Atwater, who was kind of a tragic hero in the sense that a very establishmentarian George Bush wanted to beat Dukakis. He was behind by 17 points in the convention. He brought in Lee Atwater. We got the Willie Horton ad, the Boston Harbor ad, the tank ad, and when he got done with him, he won, and then, of course, Atwater died very quickly. But whether he didn't want to ever do that again and soil himself, as he might put it, or whether he didn't have Atwater, his campaign against Bill Clinton was not like the one that he waged against Dukakis. Bill Clinton waged a campaign against Bush in the manner Bush had waged against Dukakis. And Republicans got the reputation that they would rather lose nobly than win ugly at the presidential level. And Trump thought he could, not doing that would be resonate. I think it did.
That's another good question. What are the top factors that may destroy the United States from within or undermine us from within? And the questioner just lists things like socialism or racial conflict, that sort of thing, social rot. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as a historian, I try to ask myself what undermines successful projects. And one of them, of course, is debt. And you can always see that as a numismaticist by the debasement of the currency. You know, what it shows you is that people are not producing goods and services at the level that they're expending them. We have a $22 trillion debt, and I think Donald Trump thinks that he can get through the 2020 without a 5% cut. He might, but he's going to have to address that. That's a non-sustainable project. Another thing is that we're one of the only multiracial countries in the history that's made it so far. Austria-Hungary, Rome made it for a while, but there's no evidence in history that identity politics, balkanization, and a society in which your primary identification is your race works in a multiracial society. You have to have a common cultural, shared culture, and you also have to have the idea that your outward appearance is secondary, not essential to who you are. And I'm afraid that we're regressing on that. When Rome got to the point where legions up on the Rhine River did not speak Latin very well, and they felt that they had more in common with German tribesmen on the other side of the river, and when they were ordered to go down and fight in the Atlas Mountains across, and they didn't want to leave, then you could see what was going to happen very easy. So multiracialism is essential if you're going to be a multiracial society, to have an integrated, assimilated population. Debt is another one. Mm-hmm. Corruption's another one, but where would we start with that one?
Mm-hmm. We see it in the lower numbers on trust in just about every societal institution that we have. One question here, is the prudery of the right with regards to Trump's tweeting real, or is it a manufactured issue? Is it sincere?
What was the
Their prudery, their Victorian style.
Yeah.
I was looking for that word.
You know, a couple things. I don't like, I wrote a column once calling, why can't he hang up his Twitter gloves and as a boxer say, I won, and put them in gold and retire. But that was kind of a foolish thing to write, because he's still president, and his approval rating is just about where it was when he got elected. So he whatever it is. But I think we miss a couple of things about I did about the tweeting, and I tried to readdress that in the book, is that for all of his obnoxious tweeting, have you noticed that they're mostly retaliatory? Mm-hmm. That even John McCain, in his worst moment when he shouldn't have said something quite mean, that he wishes that he had captured somebody rather than be captured. That was, by the way, stolen from the movie Patton, which was a verbatim transcript in the movie of a speech Patton gave to his own force. You didn't ever win a war by getting killed or getting wounded or getting captured. You do that to the enemy. And that's what Trump, I think, saw on TV. But we forgot that that occasion was prompted by John McCain saying a very mean thing. And he said, Trump has brought the crazies out of the woodwork. Colin Kaepernick had said something, Jussie Smollett had said something about Trump. So when he gets in these back and forth, he scans the horizon, he sees people who have attacked him, and then he calibrates very quickly, do they have 51% approval or not? And if it's a question, or there's people getting tired of the person he attacks, and he goes nuclear on them, he attacks more, he's not proportional. He believes that disproportionality is advantageous, and that they usually work. And I can't think of anybody who's got in a Twitter war with him who came out better for it. And it's almost as if he's saying, I'm going to bring you down into the wrestling mat. And I've already been in the wrestling mat physically, you haven't. And if you want to come down with me, it doesn't bother me, I've been there before. And he actually physically has. But they don't seem to, they want to start something, but they don't want to go down and finish it with him. Mm-hmm. And so he called that the new presidential. But again, if you compare some of the things that we know from the early founders and what people said about Lincoln, and it's not new. Mm-hmm. It's not at all new.
Drawing upon your classicist tradition, is Trump a good example of Machiavelli's prince?
Well, he has, I think that I think I said in the book once, I made a direct comparison with Hillary, and she was considered educated and well-prepared, and yet she had no insight. He was considered sloppy and temperamental and loose with the facts and truth, but he had an animal cunning and prescience. And I did, when I wrote the book, read I think 4 of those books: The Art of the Deal, The Art of the Comeback, You Can Be a Millionaire, or whatever, that billionaire. And it's almost true to script. A lot of it's out of Machiavelli, whether knowingly or not. If you go into a room and you want to cut a deal, have in your mind what you think success is. If it's 52%, then you demand 90%. And then you wait, and then you act crazy and loud, and you make the person feel uncomfortable. And then when you walk out of the deal, you have to walk out of the deal if you don't get your 52%. But you never insult or you never defame the person to such a degree that he's not able to call you back up. So when people said, we hear this all the time, he said a nice thing about this monster Kim. Maybe shouldn't have said it, but what he's doing is he doesn't want to say something about a Chinese or Korean leader that precludes further discussion, which might lead to a deal might be advantageous for his country. And there's a lot of Machiavelli in that. Machiavelli has said also, don't get on the wrong side of generals, and he seems to be, he brought 3 of them in for a while. So, yeah, so anyway.
Yeah, I'll ask the question here. You mentioned the generals. More broadly than that in the book, you can repeatedly come back to some of his, so the quality of his appointments at the cabinet level and so on, and to the bench. Any reflections on that relative to the kind of people that he might be attracted to nominate and appoint versus maybe some of the other 16 that were in that?
I think when he came into office, remember, the first president without military or political experience, and he had alienated the establishments of both parties. So this city has this revolving door of wise men, Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Brookings, previous think tankers, Georgetown professors. That group usually then steps forward and says, I want to help the new president, and makes the necessary adjustments. But this group had signed so many petitions, and everybody was on record that he was a monster, a buffoon, so they had eliminated themselves from consideration. And that's the right, not the left. That he really didn't have people, but he did have 2 margins of adjudication that he thought he'd always could rely on. He really admired military leaders and business people who made. So he brought in 3 generals, and he brought in people like Rex Tillerson. And then I think he discovered very quickly, I don't think this is true, by the way, in the case of Kelly or McMaster as much, maybe as Jim Mattis, but he discovered very quickly that many of the people that he brought in that he so respected because of their military or business experience did not share that populist strain of his agenda. We saw that in the 2018 September 5th anonymous with an editorial in the New York Times where a high official in Trump basically declared war on Trump, said our duty is not to enact what he wants. So I think what he was stuck with then was he had a lot of people who said, this is what Trump really, really wants to do, according to my opinion, and even if he doesn't really, really want to do, I think he should do it, so I'm going to push him, and we got that adults in the room stereotype. But now I think what he's decided is with Bolton and Pompeo and Barr probably and others, I think he found people who, whatever their own personal choices are, they realize that he has an agenda or a vision, and that agenda and vision is not nuts, and even if it's not 100% there, it's their duty to enhance that agenda. And so I think he feels more comfortable with people around him, and that's not to deprecate H.R. McMaster at all. I think he's a wonderful person. I think he tried to enact that agenda, but I think for Bolton it will be easier to do, and the same thing is true. I think Pompeo's doing a wonderful job.
Are there historic parallels between the standoff between the United States and China today that is a country seen as a strategic competitor by the national security establishment, but deeply entwined with the global economy?
Well, when you say the word economy, it was probably not invented to the abstract recognition there is an economy to very late in probably the 18th century. But there's surely a notion that a great power creates rivals and creates threats, and yet if you get in a war with it, and I'm thinking mostly the late 18th century and early 19th century rivals between Napoleon and Britain. And when Napoleon thought he could take on the British Empire because it essentially had no land army, and he could take, pretty much prefigured Hitler, he could take over the entire Moscow to the Atlantic Ocean land continent and thereby alienate Britain. But he didn't quite understand the relationships of commerce, the New World, the importance of sea power, the way Hitler didn't understand sea power and air power. And so what I'm getting at is that Trump feels that something has to be done about China now before, according to the Chinese Communist Congress, 50 years they'll take over. But to do so will require a level of disruption. And by that I mean there are people in the United States who had factored in stagnant middle-class wages. And that would be acceptable, they thought, because Chinese cheap importation had lowered the cost of real goods from tennis shoes to television sets that the middle classes could afford without rising wages, because the real cost was getting lower each year. And that was because China was accepting maybe not very little profit or not very much profit at all in these products. And when we were told, yeah, they're doing that to grab market share and they're going to get wealthy sometime and then the prices will go up, we didn't believe that. And so when people criticize his China policies and they say, well, he used the taboo T word, tariff, the answer is if you believe China is an existential threat in trade, it cheats, has a $650 billion surplus, it's the second largest world account surplus, it's violated every element of world commercial protocol. What exactly do you have to force it to be nice other than a tariff or other than military force? I'd rather have a tariff for a while and take the hit than try to invade the Spratly Islands. But people seem to think, why did he have to do this? They complain about China espionage or China technological appropriation. They say we got to have it stopped, but no president ever stopped it. In fact, it was worse than that. Their idea was that we're all from Tiananmen Square on. Tiananmen Square was just a speed bump, and the wealthier China got at our expense, then the more liberalizing they would become, and their consumer class would sort of want to all go to Stanford, and they'd all want to make China into Carmel. And that didn't happen. And yet we were supposed to put up with all these asymmetries for that to happen. And, we got in this mindset that after World War II, when there was no competition from France or China or Japan or Russia, and Britain went socialist, and we had this monopoly on goods and services, and that we can pay any price and do anything on trade or global leadership or Vietnam, Korea, intervene, and we're always so wealthy and powerful. And what happened was but there was a large element of the population, mostly in the interior, who said, we inordinately pay for that with blood and treasure, or we're not getting the benefits of globalization, or why do you worry more about those people than us? Whether you agree with that idea or not, I think Trump did tap into that.
I think we're getting close to the end here, and I want to ask a final question.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the book, you make reference to how you have never actually met the president.
Yeah.
If you were to meet with him, what would you most want to convey? What would you like the meeting to address in terms of the things we've talked today and anything else?
Well, I think I'd say, I hadn't thought of that, but I think I'd probably say three things. On policy-wise, I'd like him to find a way to address the debt, something like the Simpson Bowls, something that wouldn't crash the economy, something that would at least show, and because he has a reputation for doing things that he promised. I think that's pretty good. The other is that when I wrote the book, I didn't start out that way, but, and I don't want to be obsequious, but I'd like to ask him something about his health or resilience, because I can't think of a figure who gets up every morning at the age of 72 and then reads attacks on his wife, his children, himself, his career 30 years ago, his looks. I've never seen a level of vituperation or vitriol, and I wonder, I'd like to know how he does it, because I couldn't do it. And that would be, just as a philosophical question, I'd like him to ask that. And then third, I think it would be important to suggest to him that both he and the opposition that he incurs are abnormal for our times, but the Republic is not in danger by that, by having a strong view and replying to your enemies, and that nothing he has done compares to things we've done in the past. If he's having an order, a national emergency order to build a wall, then it's not quite comparable to Andrew Jackson after the Civil War declaring no more habeas corpus in the state of Tennessee, or the McClatchy papers egging on the Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, who egged on FDR to inter thousands of Japanese, not residents alone, but Japanese American citizens. So we've done things and we've made mistakes. I'm not saying that how about them, or they do it too, but again, not to suggest that he should have confidence in what he's doing is not beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm. Okay, with that, could you join me in a nice warm round of applause?